Welcome to the G20 Higher Education Forum on World Universities Summit on the theme of Universities of the Future, Building Institutional Resilience, Social Responsibility, and Community Impact in G20 countries. So we are in the session discussing treading a new path for first-generation learners, stories from the world. We have a distinguished panel with us today, Professor Bala, Academic Advisor, University of Illinois, Chicago. We also have with us Professor Kenneth, Holland, Professor Jindal Global Law School, Professor Jayanth, Krishnan, Milt and Judi, Stewart, Professor of Law, Indiana University. And we have with us Professor Daniel Stein, Assistant Professor, Jindal Global Law School, and Dr. Sekar Viswanathan, Vice President, VIT University. Myself, Professor Anamika Srivastava. I am associated with Jindal University for 10 years almost. And I have witnessed a transformational journey of this very special institution. So on the topic that we are discussing today, first generation learners, my first thought on this topic is around the definitional issues. I was thinking about who are first generation learners. Typically, we are talking about vis-a-vis formal education system or university space, students whose parents have not attended universities or post-secondary education. But what if they have attended but not have completed? So is it about having a degree or not having a degree? Or what if one parent has attended university and the other has not, but the parent who has attended is not that influential at home, not available at home for various reasons, and it is the parent who does not have attended the post-secondary education is more influential and therefore might shape up some of the difficulties that a student, a first-generation student would have, in a post-secondary setup. I was also thinking about, is it learners? Because we are learners, like we are human beings, we learn all the time. So it is about vis-a-vis formal education system. So maybe across universities, different terminologies are used. Maybe first generation students, are we talking about them? What about if both parents have attended university, but in a very different setup, in a different country altogether? Which means that it's a very different educational system that they have experience of. And what about if a student, let's say international students, our panel here is aware of that. International students who are coming from different countries, different cultural setup, their parents are educated on paper, but they do feel challenges, acclimatizing to a different institution in a different country, especially engaging with the knowledge, governance, and socializing institutions within the university space that we expect them to engage with. So there are certain, of course, we can keep on intellectualizing about the concept itself, but then there are practical implications of these questions. And I was wondering if the wonderful panel that we have here today can have their opening remarks around the very issue or very term, very concept of first generation learners in their own experiences from their institutions, what they would like to talk about. I would start with Jayanth. Jayanth, I'll give the stage to you.
Well, thank you so much, Anamika, and it's great to be on this panel. This issue of first generation students, first generation learners, I actually like that term quite a bit, learners, because in a way that broadens who we might be thinking of. In my experience, so I've had two different institutional experiences. One where I was at so I teach at a law school currently that's part of a larger university setting, and we're located in a part of rural America. We're in a place in southern Indiana, which is in the Midwest of the United States, but it's as I say, there's a lot of students who go to our university who come from a diverse array of backgrounds. And To me, I like the broad definition that you're giving us because I see that in many different types of students that we have at our institution. I mean, I think one of the key aspects also that when we're having our conversation is how do socioeconomics play into this and economic stability for the student who is coming to a university. How does that effectively, how does that change the calculus as opposed to somebody who has a history of family members having higher educational degrees? I think that's something to keep in mind. But one of the things that I think also we have to be thinking about when we're looking at first generation students is the divide between public and private institutions. So my first position before I got to Indiana, which is a big state public university, was at a private institution. And at our private institution that I taught at, which was a wonderful place called William Mitchell Law School, there was a long history of providing education in the evenings at night. So it would allow for second career students. So one thought as we're considering the subject is to look at people who have opted not to go to university straight out of high school, but have rather gone into the vocational sector and then decided that they want to pursue a degree. And many times that can only be done on a part-time basis or in the evening. Again, because of this issue relating to socioeconomics. So I think as we're considering this topic, keeping these nuances in mind, as you did in your opening, would be very important. So I'll stop there and cede the floor to someone else. Thanks.
Wonderful, Jayanth, and the distinction between public and private is interesting, and that brings another layer to the complex issue that we are talking about at the moment. Sekar, you are heading a premier private university in India and a professional one primarily. Of course, there are expansion to your university, and we have all witnessed that. I was wondering that what are your comments on the very idea of first generation learners and your own experience, your institutional experience? And do you really think private public divide is something that we should be taking up?
Hi, Anamika. Thank you. It's nice to be part of this wonderful session. At VIT, we have a program mainly targeting at the rural students. We call it STARS, support the advancement of rural students. So in this program, I find a lot of first generation learners, students. In my, let me first tell you about the program. We actually get kids from government schools located in villages, and from each district of our state, we select one boy and one girl and give them completely free education, free housing, everything free, and give them special mentoring and nurture them. So in this program, we find, I mean, coming back to this definition of it, I think that if both parents are have not attended college or have not graduated, and they have very limited knowledge about going to college and educating them, usually what happens is this is associated with poverty. There's a very strong correlation between education and poverty in this scenarios I'm talking about. So the kids who go to school, those government school, not government aided school, the government schools located in villages are the poorest of the poor, and they haven't had education. So far my experience has been that all the students who have admitted, it's like 71% of the students are first generation. So coming back to the definition, it's both the parents who haven't gone to college, and such things would be coming under this definition. There's a lot I want to talk about, but no, I'll stop here and give opportunity for others to start.
Thank you, Sekar, for that. And a very important point that you've talked about, how first generation learners, when we talk about them, we need to see or sort of contemplate why first generation learners? What are the obstacles that actually led them or their parents not have that education? And poverty, as you were saying, is correlated with that, the socioeconomic situation of generations that has they have felt themselves disadvantageous to formal education system for various reasons, and that needs to be sort of talked about. Thank you for that. Kenneth, anything on definitional issues to add to already, sort of like very rich discussion that we're having here?
Yeah, so it's an excellent discussion so far. For statistical purposes, it's very important to understand that large organizations that measure the performance of first generation learners, they use a very strict definition. So we always have to keep that in mind. And the strict definition is the one you mentioned earlier. Neither parent has attended any post-secondary education. So no technical education, no bachelor's education, neither parent has attended any post-secondary school. So that's the strict statistical definition that's used. And I'll speak from two different hats that I have worn. Before I joined Jindal, I was the president of the American University of Afghanistan. And there, of course, I had to deal with this problem of the first generation learners. And the problems presented themselves in very many different ways. The first was the difference between male and female students. The male students were often expected to be earners for their family. And so they tended to work oftentimes a full-time job, as well as taking a full slate of academic credits. So we had to accommodate them by offering classes all through the day and into the evening. So that was one problem of the first generation learners, is the expectations of their family that they will work while they are also going to school. The second problem were the female students. And what I encountered there was that in Afghanistan, it's very important financially for families that their daughters marry early and marry well. And there was a lot of pressure on the female students to marry, to give in to their families on the pressure to engage in a arranged marriage. So I would say that if you're dealing with developing countries, universities face challenges that universities in developed countries don't face. So one is this expectation of the families that their children work while going to school, and also this pressure on their daughters to marry before they graduate. So those are two problems. My other hat is I'm actually a Canadianist. So I'm the past president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. So I'll speak, from that point of view. As you know, Anamika, there is an acute labor shortage in Canada right now. So the unemployment rate is extremely low, and there's a huge demand for university graduates. So this problem of the first generation learner is very critical to Canada's economic progress. So Canada must find ways of recruiting students whose parents did not go to university and of retaining them. And the most serious, I think two statistics stand out. One is that the dropout rate for continuing generation students at Canadian universities is 16%. The dropout rate for first generation learners in the same universities is 33%. So universities need to put a lot of emphasis on retention of these first generation learners. Another interesting statistic is that a much higher percentage of Canadian female high school graduates go on to university than male graduates. So only 25% of Canadian boys who graduate from high school go on to the university, whereas 34% of Canadian girls do go on to university. So there's a big gender gap, and that needs to be addressed as well. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kenneth, for that. And of course, the gender issues that you talked about, the distinction between developed and developing countries, and some of the pertaining issues in the Canadian economic system, educational landscape, especially those glaring statistics I would talk about. We'll take those in the second round of the questions. Continuing with the definitional issues, Daniel, your input.
Sure. I want to speak from my own experience and pull out a couple of other threads. I said very clearly, neither of my parents have graduated from college, from university. I was talking to my dad last night and he said, but I was at university for 5 years and I never graduated. I was there for 5 years and never graduated. So by Ken's definition, I wouldn't be on that list. He attended for a long time. My mother attended 3 different universities over the course of 5 years and for a year each and never graduated. But even just saying that has another difference that I want to talk about, and which I didn't hear you mention in the introduction, is that my grandfather was a college graduate. And so I'm not a first generation learner. He was an accountant. He practiced accounting in New York City for several years. He was a graduate of NYU, but I did not have much of a relationship with him. Did that make a difference? And even so, so let me talk about a couple of more distinctions. I thought, Jayanth very helpfully mentioned this issue of class and of poverty, and how in the US, the financial circumstances are so important. The cost of education, the student debt is all in the news. And I recall I went to a public university for my undergraduate degree in the US. And I recall several years after getting out, the tuition was not that bad at the time. Recently, it has skyrocketed. But I recall my father saying to me, he said, having not been a college graduate myself, I didn't really know the whole scholarship system how it worked. And I didn't really know that you might have been eligible for X, Y, and Z, that you were, your grades were good enough, you did well enough on tests. I just had no idea that all of this funding was out there. And so, yes, you went to the state university, yes, but even just going to a state university in the US and not going to one of the fancier private universities has, these are all sort of steps that you can take. But also in the US, your undergraduate degree is separate from your legal degree. And so law school in the US is a graduate degree. And so I went to law school when I was 35 years old after 10 years of working. And I'm the first lawyer in my family. And I could tell the difference with the other students who came from legal backgrounds, who could ask their parents legal questions, who were quicker on the uptake with some of these issues. And that was a big difference. But I went to a private law school and could really tell the difference there. So I'll leave it at, I'll leave those couple of issues. Obviously, I'm teaching in Jindal now. I have I'm in India, seeing the difference with students who clearly come from legal families, students who come from their parents are doctors, and then the struggles that I have had to talk to students about their families, about their class. But I will leave that all for now and come back in round 2 for a little bit more.
Wonderful, Daniel. Wonderful. Very fortunate to have you on the panel and knowing your story and so much of insight. Yes, apologies for not including grandparents, although that wasn't on my mind, like parents, grandparents, and interesting to know, like when you say generation, first generation, but is it like first generation, or you can have grandparents educated and parents not educated, and those complex issues. And I do believe that the definitional issues around the topic is still relevant because, of course, we have some for statistical purposes, we do have those official definitions at place at some level. But institutions have been playing around or sort of like experimenting with the very concept to include as many students as possible who find themselves to be in disadvantageous position. So it's about like identifying your own position vis-a-vis the institution, the formal system, and sort of like saying that, yes, I find myself in a disadvantageous position for various reasons. Like as I was talking about international students in a Western countries traveling from India too, and they might find themselves to be in a disadvantageous position. So a sort of a self-determination there. Interesting, Daniel, thank you for that. And Sean, your inputs on something that we have, it's a very interesting discussion that's going on. Sean, your take on it.
Yeah, so, just following up with a number of things that have been spoken about. So I come at this issue from both a personal and professional perspective, though I guess I'm not technically first generation. I identify as such. And so as a student, a first generation student, went to an elite institution, and I'll explain in a moment about that, and also worked in both India, but also has worked here at an institution. I work at an institution right now that prides itself on access, having increased access to for students from diverse backgrounds or students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I think that we have to, while unpacking the question of what is a first generation student, we have to accept that university spaces and modern university spaces are not designed for students from unprivileged backgrounds. Now, universities have gone through a massive evolution in the past 60, 70 years, but a lot of the bones of what makes an institution have not changed. Universities have resources, they have opportunities, they have many different things that students can take advantage of, but they're built on the premise that students know how to take advantage of them, or that they can navigate or find their way through them. So the key is access. Mere educational access is not enough. Now, I can speak to this from personal perspective. I was part of the second class of students who was accepted to Harvard under the Financial Aid Initiative, which was an initiative that said that students could go to the college for free if their families paid under $40,000 a year. When I went to this institution, it was almost as if we were sort of given a life preserver and said, okay, you're here, and sort of pushed in. There was no sort of support at the time for first generation students to navigate things, to understand that there were going to be some real cultural barriers. And I think that that's true of both elite institutions or, private institutions, but also public institutions. There are many cultural barriers that students who may come from backgrounds where their parents went to college or finished college, or people who come from, better socioeconomic places, know those sort of implicit cultural assumptions or implicit social assumptions. So I can see from my own work with my students here at UIC, very basic things that are so essential, but students don't understand necessarily how to navigate, such as the importance of internships and professional networking, how to speak to professors and find research opportunities, where you go when you're having mental health issues. All of these things are issues that many students, especially from first generation backgrounds, don't know how to access. So universities, again, are, I think that there are these structural issues. In the West, especially, cost is a big factor. Many first generation students really need deep financial support. And it's if a person can't meet their basic needs, it's like many theories around the idea of poverty, if a person can't meet their basic needs, then they're not able to thrive in the environment that they're in. And I think that that's true of a university space where many students are forced by the structure of the institution to purchase expensive textbooks, to live in expensive dorms, buy expensive meal plans, which, you know, they don't really need. You know, all of these things add up. The last thing I would just add is, again, I think that one of the things that makes this question so difficult is that a university education is more than just something monetary. It's more than something for your career. It's something cultural. It means something culturally. And, you know, on one hand, you have many people getting university educations, and it's seen as something to aspire to. People want their children to do better than they have done, to go on. On the other hand, a substantial portion of the population, you know, in the US especially, doesn't go to college. I was struck by a recent statistic, I think from 2020 or 2021, only 34% of the American population has a university degree. So that's almost 2/3 of the population does not have a university degree. And universities are being caught up in culture war issues. So, you know, and I don't think it's just here, I think it's all over, that universities are seen as these sort of elite spaces that are targeted. So I just bring that up to bring up that there is this cultural tension between this, and I think first generation students are caught in the middle of it. This university as an aspirational thing, but also university as this site of social and political tension that I think is worth thinking about as those students are trying to navigate their way through these things. So thank you.
Thanks, Sean, for that. And interesting too. I mean, you raised a very important point about that, how universities are not particularly, they have, to begin with, they're not designed for the masses and still sort of not, maybe sort of not aligned with the interests, or let's say the preferences, or customized to the disadvantageous population for various reasons, and first generation learners being one of them. Jayanth, coming back to you for the second round, there are, of course, there are academic, you know, adjustments that we need to make in the very core content, syllabus, pedagogy. But then what about outside classroom? Like we'll come to academic, but non-academic aspects of support systems that are required for first generation students. What are your inputs, institutional experiences about what could be best practices around support systems for the students?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I just will want to pick up on what Sean was saying, because actually in my notes, I had written down as I was preparing for today's panel, many of the points that he alluded to and stated actually quite, I think, articulately, which was that, yeah, I would say one of the key aspects is a real need to focus on the mental health situation of all of our students, generally speaking, but in particular for first generation students. I've seen that firsthand, that the demand is there. And while I think universities do try their best, I think we're grappling with it. It's a lot different set of norms and expectations that students have today. And I think thankfully so. I mean, I think that that's really important. I was also going to mention something that Sean stated, which involved internships. So one of the key aspects that we have at our law school is an internship program where every summer we place law students in 13, 14 different countries around the globe. And one of the key criteria that we look for is how can the cohort that we are bringing in for that summer class add diversity. And that, you know, of course, there's diversity along racial, ethnic, gender lines that we value, but also life experiences. And students, for example, who have never traveled outside the state of Indiana we look at as people who could add a great deal to our program. And many of those students are in fact first generation students. So that's the second aspect. And I would say a third aspect that we have been really trying to develop intensely is a focus on writing and writing skills. And generally speaking, I think students need help with writing. But oftentimes when it comes to students who feel the need for that assistance the most, they often are not the ones who are affirmatively making the request. And so we have specifically devoted writing programs at our law school, outside tutoring for students who need that type of aid. And I think that is a key aspect. I'll just mention one other thing very quickly, which is, and this might sound, to those of us who have been in an institutional environment, not all that radical, but I think it's quite important. Teaching students how to interview and providing interview workshops is key. And as unfortunate as it is, I think also the norms of how to present oneself in an environment that has been standardized during the professionalization process, that's a crucial aspect as well. And so that may mean doing mock sessions of what an employer-employee type of interview might look like. Dress code, what that might entail. A lot of these things that many of us might take for granted, I think we have to be sensitive to, particularly for students who are first generation.
Thank you, Jayanth, for that number of issues that have been raised already regarding the possible interventions that could be provided. Sekar, you already talked about the affirmative actions that your university is taking. Do you want to add to that, especially in terms of understanding that you're training professionally students, especially for the job market? And I'm understanding that even if there are limitations, but university is still a space for accommodating, at least thinking about these issues. But when it comes to job market, we cannot expect the job market to be as accommodating as universities are supposed to be or are trying to be. What are the gaps that you see in that respect, and what has been your intervention like?
So our experience has been very positive in the results. So these first generation kids whom I referred to in my earlier part, many of them are so poor, when they joined class, they couldn't even afford footwear. The entire family came in bare feet, and they cannot afford the bus charges to come to college only once. And the bus charges are very, very inexpensive in India. So many of these families' monthly income is like $10. So the program we have has changed their complete family. Now there's one student who came from such a poor family, now works for Facebook in Bay Area, and the other student works for Amazon in Seattle. So their family incomes has multiplied like 50 times, 100 times. So the key issue, which other speakers also mentioned, there's a lot of support system required. A person who cannot afford footwear goes into a big institution, he or she sees all the other kids, majority other kids wearing flashy clothes and flashy shoes and all that. So it brings in an inferiority complex in them. That's very, very important, where we provide support system. And the second point is communication skills, right? All the other kids speak in English, but these kids don't know English because they study in their Tamil medium or local medium. And when they come in, they're very afraid to speak in the class. So what we do at VIT is we provide them special mentors to completely support them those 4 or 5 years in the college so that they can speak to them in their mother tongue and then explain them in English. And then we provide them special English training programs. I think first thing is to build that confidence in them. That happens when we give them, knowledge of communication. So that's one aspect, building them confidence, providing them special mentoring. And after that, as Jayanth pointed out, we provide a lot of interviewing skills and other soft skills. How do you work in a team? How do you face an interview? How do you do a group discussion? All those soft skill training programs are being given every year for these first generation learners. And we have found that it has had a tremendous effect. They even go to a stage and can do a public speaking in English, even though they make some mistakes, but they develop the confidence to go in front of a few hundred people and speak. So building confidence, providing them the skill set right from English communication skills to interviewing skills, and all those requires a lot of effort from the university, but it's well worth it, and families change.
Wonderful, Sekar. Thank you for those efforts. And I believe you've been impacting a number of students in our country. So very glad to know about the initiatives at VIT. Kenneth, given your unique experience in Canada as well, and sort of like First Nation people, maybe that there would be some overlapping issues with first generation students as well. What are the initiatives that we can take outside the classroom for them? Something that we have not discussed already that you would like to talk about?
Yes, so when you look at retention of university students, and of course, these problems are amplified twofold for the first generation students. One of the first realities is that students drop out from university because they don't feel they belong. They don't feel they have any close connections, any close relationships, not with a faculty member, not with their fellow students. So one of the initiatives that I was involved in at Michigan State University was something called the Freshman Abroad Experience. So all entering freshmen at Michigan State had to go abroad with a group of students and with a faculty member. And I actually took students to Canada. That was my job. I took them to Quebec City, to Laval University. And what you see there is several things happen. One is that because the student is with the faculty member for several weeks on a daily basis, a bond develops, a relationship develops. So the student feels connected with the university through that faculty member. The second thing you notice is that these 20 students probably did not know each other at all. But if you live together and you're traveling to a foreign country and you're trying to learn French, all of these common experiences creates a bond among the students themselves. So of the 20 students I took to Quebec City that summer, not one of them dropped out. Every single one of them graduated, and some of them were first generation learners. So any kind of summer experience prior to the beginning of the first year in which students can bond with a faculty member and with other students, that will help with retention. Mentorship programs are very important. So students can be assigned to a senior student, faculty member, staff member to serve as a mentor. Leadership education. Again, India, the United States, Canada, Australia, these are democratic countries that aspire to be meritocracies. So the best and the brightest rise to the top. So university education is critical to social mobility, and therefore it's very important for these first generation students to be enrolled in leadership programs. At Kansas State University, where I also was associated, every single student has to take a course in leadership. So that again is very good for first generation students. Their parents probably were not leaders since they were not university educated. In addition to the writing support that Jayanth mentioned, students can benefit from seminars in developing study skills. Again, they often, first generation learners have underdeveloped study skills. And then peer assisted learning, or again, their work with a senior student to help develop these study skills. Financial resources, that's been mentioned. And then mental health resources as well. So all those resources are really critical to improve the success rate for first generation learners.
Thank you, Kenneth, for sharing those experiences with us. Daniel, given your unique experience and your setting as in to some extent as first generation learner, of course there are caveats to, or let's say qualifiers to that definition. I was wondering, we are talking about efforts for first generation students, but as Jayanth and everyone else in the panel was talking about, that every student requires these support systems, like for example, mental support, mental health support, or let's say writing skills or professional skills, interview skills. Do you think targeting first generation students separately will be useful, or do you think it would be like categorizing them in a special bucket is something that approach is required, or do we need a holistic approach towards student development in general, where first generation students will also be sort of benefited? What do you think will be a better approach, Daniel?
I think can definitely be some stigma associated with it, and whether or not that is unique to the first generation learner status or has some underlying relationship to class prejudice, I'm not entirely sure about, but there is definitely a unique pressure. And figuring out how to turn this pressure into confidence is a different conversation than you will have with someone whose parents already have an established business and who knows, and the student knows that once they get their degree, they can go work for their uncle or someone already in their network. And so I think that this, whether or not there are increased support networks, it is also about unlocking the increased potential, because I do feel like students who do not have a path laid out for them can have a broader imagination, a broader grasp of what is possible. And coming from a family and feeling like, oh, well, your grandfather was a judge, your uncle was a big corporate lawyer, can sort of make you feel like there are only a few paths. And I never felt like that was a problem. And whether or not, growing up in New York City and sort of being exposed to so much of this, as much of the world is encapsulated there, feeling like that, however far I wanted to push it, there was always going to be at least some support there. And so for universities to allow students who have an idea of something that would make for an interesting internship, have an idea for a career path that does not quite exist yet, because they have been raised on, seeing that their family has been successful and they are going to want to go in that direction, and helping students develop that individuality outside of the realm of their families, because our original question was sort of outside this non-academic support, right? You're going to learn a lot in your classes. You're going to learn probably more from your friends and colleagues. But developing your capacity to learn and your capacity to imagine yourself in all of these places, and then figuring out how your network is going to take you there. And your network for first generation learners is not going to be your family, your aunts, your uncles. It might have to be the university. And so I remember at my law school, I asked them, I said, do you have a list of all of the graduates who are living overseas who I could email for a internship? And they said, that would be a really good idea if we had one. And I said, and so it took them, they were changing some of their deans. It took them a while, but they developed that. I had 2 overseas externships. I remember going into the career services office and telling them all the emails that I had already sent, and them thinking just, wow, like they couldn't have advised me to do that, even if they wanted to. And so I do feel like there are these students, some are going to come to the university and just have no idea and have to have their eyes completely opened. But once you get past that step, the potential is greater. And helping these students develop these independent, new, unique career paths for themselves to turn them into their own, blaze their own trails, not just for them, and not just for their family, but for the rest of their university, I think is crucial. And whether that means, identifying them at the outset and, there is a stigma attached. I think we're still in the realm of what Kenneth was talking about of, you're creating this bond, and the bond that students generate with each other in this introductory period is going to be, especially if they're not coming from an established network, it is going to be crucial. These are the people who they're going to meet up with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, and still share stories with. And hopefully they'll all be, doing new, cool, unique things that their family, no matter how established they were, could not have dreamed of.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. It's about giving more agency to the students at large, defining their own career path, educational journey, but more to first generation students, I guess. Sean, your take on out of class, non-academic support system that students require if they're coming from first generation learners.
Yeah, so I think that, many of the things that have been pointed to are all things that would be good supports for students, from internship support and networking support to opportunities to have experiences studying abroad or living abroad, mental health support, things of that nature. All these things are really important. And I think that the way, Anamika, that you sort of encapsulated Daniel's point about agency. I think that something I see with many of my first generation students, but I also see it with some of my international students as well, is there's a sense of loneliness, a sense of that I'm going through this by myself, that I'm the only one struggling. I'm the only one having difficulties. And something I try to do in my advising, even when I was teaching, it's the same thing, is to try to normalize that sense of struggle and that sense that, it's okay to be going through what you're going through. So beyond any of the institutional supports, I think creating a culture that has an openness to talking about struggle and to talking about difficulties is vital, especially for first generation students. I think that there is, especially for those students, there can be an intense shame at the sense that you're struggling, the sense that I've made it, and yet I'm having trouble in my classes. I've made it, yet I just can't seem to be able to get enough food, food to support myself. I've made it, but my family doesn't understand what I'm going through. That deep sense of loneliness, I think, can really make it very difficult for students to go through their time. So it's, again, as I think I mentioned in my initial points, it's not just about the institutional stuff. It's not just about the access, but it's about changing the culture of a university. Again, making it more open to students from those various experiences and backgrounds, to make it open to their experiences, and to create a culture of openness where students can talk about their struggles and their difficulties, and to not feel like that they have to hide those things in shame.
Yes, sure. Very important point about normalizing talking about struggles for anybody. Like, and then we can see how you talked about international students and first generation students in the same light, and then I do believe that there are overlapping issues when you come from a very different cultural context, and the difference between your home culture, like you go back home and you talk to your family, and the educational institution culture, that there's a difference between that, and the gap is possibly wider for those who are coming from disadvantageous position for various reasons. And today's topic is on first generation students. I was wondering, for those, because we are talking about future universities, we'll have to keep the discussion around the institutional approaches towards making life for first generation students easier. And sort of like taking up the next round of questions, the next issue that I would like to raise about is how to bring them in. Of course, we talked about access is not enough, and then we need to look at the quality of access, as Sean talked about in the last round. But then we are still grappling with the issue of how to bring them in. So when it comes to student recruitment, or let's say admission policies of the institution, what do we need to do? Do we need to change something? Do we need to come up with like drastic reforms? Or let's say the tweaks that are required to bring the first generation students inside the educational space, because we know that the gap is huge, and possibly they are not even applying. Somebody was talking about, I just didn't know where to apply the right scholarship, and I'm adding to that the issue of financial channels that are required, because sort of like clubbing them together so that panelists can take the issues according to their preference. Of course, we need scholarships are meant for merit-based students, so possibly they're not coming from they are not first generation learners. Are they catering to first generation learners? Banking system, the student loan system might discriminate first generation learners for various reasons, and we have a number of studies coming forward and sort of supporting the said and the unsaid biases against these students when they access the financial market for education. So of course, bursaries and grants are the way out, but are there other institutional best practices around the financial support system as well for them? So we're talking about admissions and finance and sort of like bringing them in. That's the issue that we're talking about. So I'll take up, let's start the next round. Jayanth, will you take this up?
Sure, I'll be brief. Well, I mean, this is one of the issues that I've been thinking about for a while. And, it's in a way for universities, at least in the United States, there's a real dilemma. And the dilemma revolves around, frankly, a desire by many institutions to be high in the rankings, and particularly one ranking instrument in particular, which is the US News and the US News phenomenon. And, I think it's one of the great evils of higher education, frankly, because what it has done has been to really give perverse incentives for universities to try and bolster their rankings. And what that's meant has been a real marginalization of access to higher education for students who need it arguably the most. And among that group are first generation students. And so because the incentive structures for universities are meant and geared towards maximizing their performance in a rating like US News, what that ends up doing is really narrowing the net for potential applicants who come from very diverse, very socioeconomically disadvantaged positions. And that's a real tragedy, I think. And so one of the ways I've argued for a long time that we can break the stranglehold that the ranking systems have on at least US universities is to think about admissions in a much more plural fashion. Now, at the undergraduate level, and my colleagues on the panel who have worked at US undergraduate institutions have far more experience on this than I do, because I teach mainly at a law school, but I do interact with our university officials who work in this line. One of the things that's been done at the US undergraduate level has been to, for example, broaden the requirements and broaden the ways that students can get into the universities. So historically used standardized tests, for example, now at many undergraduate institutions are no longer required. They have been abandoned or at the very least have been made optional for students to submit. I think going and doing active on the ground recruiting to high schools that have historically been ignored by higher educational institutions is another important path to pursue. I think involving alumni who come from diverse backgrounds is also key. And so I think the problem is, at least in the US context, because there on the one hand is this high motivation for succeeding in the US news game, which simultaneously hurts people who have been historically kept out. There's this real struggle that's going on. And I'm frankly glad to see at least now the inklings of more and more US institutions boycotting ranking systems like US News, because I think that that's one of the key ways that we can get a much more socioeconomically diverse, demographically diverse student body into the doors.
Thank you, Jayanth, for that. Very interesting. I think, Sekar, for you, since we've been talking about admissions and financial assistance and possible interventions that are required, but then since Jayanth talked about the rankings issue, do you think, and since you hold that position and sort of like thinking about how universities are doing, or let's say your institution is doing vis-a-vis these global benchmarks, or let's say national benchmarks, do you think those goals, or let's say objectives for institutions being sort of a bit contradictory to, let's say, the present concern that we are talking about, like, let's say, supporting the students from various disadvantageous situations?
Right. Jayanth is right about this global rankings, where there's a lot of pressure on some other factors, not on this inclusivity. But some of the Indian ranking and accreditation, they give weight for inclusivity and increased access. So that is encouraging for many of the Indian universities. And coming to some of the best practices in this area, what we do at VIT is we are the main sponsors for a trust called Universal Higher Education Trust. So what that trust does is raise funds to help mainly the first generation kids to go to any college, not just VIT, to any college. So VIT also pitches in a lot of funds for that trust. What the trust does is actually goes out to many of these communities and creates awareness about how to apply, which courses to choose, which program to choose, what are the scholarships available. A lot of career guidance awareness is being created out in the villages and other low-income neighborhoods. So as was pointed out, many of them don't know even how to apply or where to apply, and they're really scared that sometimes the fees will be too high. So you got to go and educate them and create awareness. So you don't stop just within the campus, within the university. You go outside the campus, go to their neighborhoods and create a lot of awareness sessions on all these topics, and then also help them financially, pay for their tuition partly and all that, and ask those other colleges to provide higher scholarships. So a lot of these things help improve the gross enrollment ratio, which is very poor in villages. And we found that the biggest beneficiaries of these programs are girls, because girls are the biggest victims in this entire scenario. I think Professor Holland pointed about the Afghan scenario. In India also, some parts, especially the rural parts, women are not encouraged. The girls are not encouraged to study, and only boys are pushed ahead. So, and especially in low-income groups, it's very common. So I think such awareness programs by the university or university-sponsored voluntary organizations would help a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Sekar, for that. Kenneth, your inputs on what universities need to change or continue doing in their admission process and the kind of financial interventions that are required to bring first-generation students in.
Yes, one way to approach this problem is, again, use statistics to identify the underrepresented groups. You mentioned the Indigenous people in Canada. 1/3 of all adult Canadians have a bachelor's degree or higher. Only 13% of Indigenous adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. So Indigenous people are very much underrepresented in Canadian universities. I was a professor at the University of Calgary, and I know that the University of Calgary in Alberta has a program where they talk to Indigenous high school students and say, what is it that we could do that would make you more interested, in matriculating in our university? And one of the things the students have told the university is they don't feel valued. And so what the university has done, they've actually changed the physical plant itself and included a lot of Indigenous art, Indigenous crafts, and have Indigenous oriented events to try to make those students feel that they're valued and welcomed at the university. So universities have to make a very concerted, very well thought out approach to make these students feel valued and included. The other group in the United States are Hispanic students. When I was at the Kansas State University, there were many meat packing plants in Western Kansas, and most of the workers in those plants were Hispanic. And again, they had not gone to universities. So the university said very few of their children come to the university. What can we do? And what we actually had to do was to go and meet with the parents. And I found this also in Afghanistan. The best recruiter are the parents. We sometimes talk to high school counselors and we talk to the high school students, but if you organize events where you invite parents and you talk about the advantages to them and their family of their children getting a university education, you get a much higher success rate. So we should not forget about appealing directly to the parents.
Very important point, Kenneth, about educating parents for that. I mean, we're talking about first-generation learners, and there is a reason for that, and sort of awareing them is so very important. So thank you for that reminder. Daniel, if you can come in and sort of your remarks on the admission process that we're talking about. Yeah, universities can be seen as gatekeeping. Some of how their admission process can gatekeep, and what can we do about it? Yes.
Well, to just carry on from what Kenneth was saying, I mean, obviously this issue, I think a couple of panelists, like there's not going to be any replacement for subsistence labor that you're getting from your children who are working on your large farm. And having this financial equation for when there is such poverty that still exists, taking 4 years out of the labor force can make a big difference. But I think, as Jayanth said in his first comment, first generation learners are more likely to have jobs when they are throughout their schooling. And when I was 20 years ago, when I was a junior and a senior, had a job at my university. And it was one that relates perfectly to this. A couple of other students and I were employed a couple of nights a week to call prospective seniors, high school seniors. And I don't know if this program still exists or how widespread it is, but there were, we would sit around 3 or 4 hours a night and have long lists of people that gave their names at college fairs or any other recruitment drive. And hearing from other students always made a difference. And so even if we only talked to one person a night, it would be one person who was more interested to hear from another student than they were from a recruitment officer, from someone in admissions. And, it was never about, I'm also a first generation. We had no idea about that. Maybe it could be more well-connected on that front. And then I guess the ones that I did when I was a senior, I would not have met, but, no follow-up. Oh, I talked to you when you were applying last year and now I'm a senior and you're a freshman. Maybe we could be part of this, but maybe that will go back and talk about, the groupings, the different support networks that can exist. But I thought that was a great program, where there's an employment. I made minimum wage while doing this, and if necessary, I could have sent some of that back to my family. And I was connecting with other students. I was, letting them know that there were other actual human beings there. It wasn't just admissions officers and administrators. And I think breaking down that barrier, making it easier to connect with other students. And maybe that means making those bonds more explicit. Hey, I'm also a first generation learner. I saw that you put down, when you went to this college fair, that you would be the first in your family. And having that come from another student who has a little bit of training as an outgrowth of this program, which was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing it for 2 years. It was a nice college job, but could be expanded, could be extended, and I think might make a difference on this issue.
Wonderful, Daniel. Another very useful reminder on including students. So all in all, we're talking about including the real stakeholders that we're talking about into the admission process, which is sometimes very professional and technical and sort of like disassociated with the real issues that we are talking about or grappling with at the time of admission, and how those becomes like obstacles for students. Yes, Sean, your take on what we have talked about up to now, admission and financial support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say two things just to sort of bounce off what Daniel was saying. I think that students meeting other students is vital. Peer tutoring. Again, I think at the nub of it is if students don't feel like that they're alone, if they don't feel like that their experiences are alone, or that that their experiences are just their own, then it helps normalize struggle and helps students be able to cope with the ups and downs of things. But I can reflect on my experience. So I actually ran JGU's admissions for 1.5 years through two admission cycles. And one of the proudest things for me was that we did an overhaul of our scholarship and how we award our scholarships. Now I'm not going to get into too deep of the weeds because I think that's probably trade secret. But the fact is that we have a mandate at Jindal, which I think is quite unique for a lot of the private universities in India, which is that we have to balance the need and the merit. Too often, a lot of institutions, and I think that there's a larger philosophical question behind that between, do we support students based on merit or do we support students based on need? And I think that there's a knee-jerk reaction in a lot of society to say, oh, it's merit because we live in a meritocracy, and it's, if a student, has good grades, then they deserve to get good, to get scholarships or good placements. And I think that sort of conversation ignores the fact that many students who are getting good grades come from privileged backgrounds. They had support when they were in high school. It doesn't necessarily mean anything inherent in the person. Just as if a person needs financial help because of need, it doesn't mean anything inherent about them. It doesn't mean anything inherent about who they are, who their families are. And that's a large, we can't solve the larger problem of the theory or the philosophy behind poverty or how we think about poverty in a day or in a night. But I do think that there is a larger point to be thought about when we're thinking about how to increase educational access for first generation students, which is that there needs to be an adequate there needs to be a really carefully thought out balance between merit and need-based work to understand that while we need to acknowledge merit and we need to reward people who have worked hard, we need to also acknowledge that, the students who have need may not have had as many opportunities to do well. And there can be students who, if given enough support, can really thrive. Given enough financial support or support, they can really thrive. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think that I like how we at JGU do admissions or have done admissions, which is that we've tried to do more of a holistic admissions for most of our programs. I think the law school is the exception, which is just does the LSAT test. But we have tried to do a holistic admissions process, which is more like what you see in the US, which is, again, trying to take into account multiple dimensions of a student to make an admissions decision. There are students who can get into top universities, but just because they have good grades doesn't mean that they're going to thrive in those institutions. And there can be students who may not have the best grades, but they have the right combination of approach and personality and, interest and drive to be able to thrive in those places. So I think that really, again, a balance between merit and need, but also I think encouraging those holistic admissions processes that can take into account the whole student.
Thanks, Sean, for that. I am receiving several questions from the audience, the live audience that we have. And I can see that we have not talked about the changes or reforms, or let's say continue doing what we're doing as best practices in terms of the academic part of university. So those the questions that I'm getting is also kind of directing towards what professors need to do, or what training programs do we need for the faculty to accommodate first generation students. And so the way I see it, because given the time paucity here, the way I see these questions, clubbing them together, in terms of academic content or the syllabus, pedagogy, faculty, what are the changes, or let's say best practices, that we are sort of endorsing here? And can we have a quick round for that, starting from Jayanth?
Sure. So I just want to make sure I understand the question, Anamika. So the question is, what can faculty in particular do here? Is that what you were saying? Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that, So one of the things that I think that faculty can do is, I mean, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but we can actually think about how we hire faculty. And so one of the problems historically is that universities tend to hire faculty members from a very rarefied sort of group of schools. And so I think one of the key aspects is trying to make more plural who gets to become a faculty member. Because if you have diversity in terms of backgrounds, in terms of who can actually be a faculty member, then I think the relatability aspect between the faculty member and students can also be broadened. So in the United States, for example, what we have right now are 5 universities at the undergraduate level that make up about 80% of all faculty hiring. That's a problem, and that's a big problem, because what that basically is saying is that the large percentage of universities that are out there are not represented in the academy. And if we are trying to make the connections between faculty and students stronger and more accommodating to students, we have to get more diverse faculty members from a variety of different backgrounds into the profession that then can translate into, as I say, stronger connections with students. So that's one aspect that we can do better at in terms of how we hire at the university.
Yes, so given the time paucity, we'll keep our comments quick, but then I do not want not to hear other panelists on this very important issue about faculty, syllabus, content, pedagogy, anything that you would like to pick up. Quick comments on that, Sekar.
I don't think we should change the curriculum and syllabus for this, but faculty could give additional material and additional time for the first generation learners outside the regular hours. It's possible, and they can do it. Thank you.
Kenneth.
Yes, I think pedagogy can play a role here. I'm a big advocate of student-centered learning as opposed to the traditional lecture method. And one of the advantages of student-centered learning is that the students are more engaged in the learning process. And if the student-centered learning includes projects and group-based projects, then the first-generation student gets an opportunity to form a relationship with other students in the class. So as we saw from my previous comments, any connection that the student can make one-on-one with the faculty member, one-on-one with other students, that increases the sense of belonging and increases the chance that student will remain throughout the 4 years of a university education.
Yes, Daniel.
I'm going to go back to writing capacity. I think Jayanth mentioned it a very long time ago, and I remember this when I was in law school, just reading other colleagues' memos. It was very obvious if another lawyer in their family had read it first. And so for me as a teacher, there's one internal written assignment and then a final assignment. And after my first semester, I said, you know what, after they submit their first written assessment and they get a grade back from me, I have to give an opportunity to make revisions. I have to give, they get a marked up piece of paper, this is on my red pen, but with a lot of ink on it, or it was all digital the first semester, and to have them see those revisions and be able to hand that back, especially when I'm teaching first semester students, the first semester at school, they get something back with all of these comments on it. Legal writing has a totally different format from any other writing that you're going to do that you might think is effective. And so even allowing that editing process, and some of the students who got a very high mark, it was obvious someone read it before, they don't really need it as much, but I've seen just even that make a difference for students to be able to get a second chance on it, to see my notes as the first professor they've interacted with, and be able to submit it again, having seen my comments, seen my edits. Maybe I'm the first lawyer who's ever read something they've written. And maybe going forward, I could make it more explicit that I will do this for you outside of class as well. And maybe that is a shift that I can make.
Wonderful. Love the self-introspection here, Daniel, and thank you for the takeaway. Sean.
So yeah, I think that the idea of trying to get beyond lecture, more traditional methods of education is really important. All these sort of pedagogical practices are not just good for first generation students, they're good for everybody. It's instance where I think a rising tide lifts all boats in this particular case. So I think that focusing on student-centered learning, focusing on experiential learning, which is one of the things that, one of the things I really enjoyed when I was teaching at JSLH, sort of experiential learning as a feature of a lot of our courses. I think that sort of learning can really help students really gain a strong confidence in their own abilities to be able to pose questions and to be able to conduct their own research in a way that is a lot less intimidating than if we throw a lot of information at them and we talk at them. So I think that's one thing that can be done to help help make our classroom spaces more accepting or more welcoming to first generation learners.
Wonderful, Sean. Given the time here, we'll have to wrap up this discussion. Thank you so much, all the panelists. Wonderful discussion, wonderful points. I think since we began the discussion with the disadvantageous situation of the first generation learners, but one of the highlights of today's session is how we talked about their strengths as well, and given their situation, how first generation students are also capable of showing extreme resilience and perseverance and sort of like ensuring us and institutions need to take that into account as well as they respond to a number of initiatives for them. So with that thought, I will end this session. Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists for joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.